It started with the phone. Every night for a week, it rang at exactly 3 a.m., not a minute before, not a minute after. I'd jolt awake, heart pounding, eyes wide open in the dark, watching that faint glow of the screen cutting through my room like a knife. Same number, same silence, every single night. And each time, I told myself not to answer. You know that feeling when your instincts scream something's wrong, but curiosity keeps twisting its fingers around your throat? That was me, half afraid, half drawn in, like a moth circling a candle it knows will burn it. By the 7th night, I'd had enough. I was exhausted, no, beyond exhausted. I hadn't slept more than 2 hours straight all week, and my nerves were frayed so badly I was jumping at every creak in the floorboards. I thought maybe it was a prank or some kind of tech glitch or one of those weird spam scams. But the truth was, deep down, I knew it wasn't any of that. The way that phone lit up at exactly 3 a.m. to the second felt too intentional. Too personal. So that night, when it rang again, I sat up in bed, stared at it for a long moment, and said out loud, "Fine, you win." My voice didn't sound like my own. It sounded like someone much older, much tired. I reached over, hand shaking, and pressed accept. And that's when I heard it. My own voice, whispering, low, almost tender, right into my ear. "You shouldn't have answered." I froze. For a second, I thought I must be dreaming. That half-awake, half-asleep hallucination where your brain starts playing tricks on you. But no, the sound was real. My phone was warm in my hand, the lamp beside my bed still flickering weakly, and the air felt thick, heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. I didn't even realize I'd gotten out of bed until I saw my reflection in the living room mirror. I was standing there, barefoot, gripping my phone like a weapon, the screen still glowing faintly against my skin. Behind me, the golden lamp threw long shadows across the wall, making everything look distorted, wrong. My reflection seemed to tremble, like it wasn't sure if it wanted to move when I did. I whispered, "Who is this?" Nothing. Just the faint static crackle of a dead line. I should have hung up right then, should have shut off the phone, thrown it across the room, something. But instead, I stood there, listening, waiting for my own voice to come back. And here's where things get really strange, because that voice, my voice, didn't come through the phone again. It came from somewhere else in the house. At first it was faint, like an echo, the kind of sound you could almost convince yourself you imagined. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. "You shouldn't have answered." My heart felt like it was punching through my chest. I spun around so fast I nearly dropped the phone. The living room was empty, completely still. But I swear I saw something, just a flicker of movement near the hallway that led to the guest room. Now, before I tell you what happened next, you should know something about me. I'm not the kind of person who scares easily. Or at least, I didn't used to be. I've been through things that make most people crumble. Betrayal, humiliation, the kind of heartbreak that leaves scars you can't see. Maybe that's why when I heard that whisper again, part of me wasn't afraid. Part of me was angry. Because the voice, it wasn't just mine. It was hers. Her name was Leela, my twin sister. And she'd been dead for almost 2 years. You ever lose someone so close that the air feels different without them? Like even silence sounds wrong now? That's what it was like when Leela died, We weren't just sisters, we were halves of the same person. Same laugh, same stubborn streak, same everything. Until she met him, Elias, the man who would eventually destroy both of us. I met him first, actually. I was the one who introduced them. Back then, I thought he was charming. A little too smooth, maybe, but smart, funny, confident in that way that made people listen when he talked. He worked in real estate, made good money, knew how to make people feel seen. I thought he'd be good for her. I thought he'd make her happy. But I didn't know what kind of man he really was. Not until it was too late. The first signs were small. Leela started canceling plans, saying she was tired or busy or just not feeling great. Then she stopped calling altogether. I'd text, she'd reply hours later, short, polite messages that didn't sound like her at all. Eventually, she stopped answering. I went to her house once, Elias's house technically, and he told me she wasn't home. The look he gave me, cold, dismissive, like I was trespassing. 3 months later, she was gone. They said it was an accident. Car accident, rainy night, bad visibility. But the details never added up. She wasn't drinking, she wasn't reckless, she was careful, maybe too careful. And yet somehow she lost control on an empty stretch of road she'd driven hundreds of times before. I tried to ask questions, but Elias shut me out completely. Sold the house, disappeared within weeks. The police said there was no foul play. Case closed. I never believed it. So when that phone rang at 3 a.m. and I heard her voice, my voice, saying, "You shouldn't have answered," I knew this wasn't random. This was her, or something tied to her. But here's where the story shifts from tragedy to revenge. Because that moment, that whisper in the dark, didn't just scare me. It woke something up inside me, something that had been asleep for 2 long, grieving years. I couldn't shake it. The next morning, I tore through my old boxes. Every photo, every text, every memory of her I tucked away to avoid breaking down. I replayed her last few voicemails over and over, listening for something I'd missed. Maybe a clue, maybe a warning. And that's when I noticed it. Her last voicemail to me, one I hadn't been able to delete, wasn't quite right. There was something in the background, just faintly. A voice, a man's voice, Elias's, saying something like, "She won't tell." That's when the cold realization hit me. My sister didn't die in an accident. She was silenced. And for the first time in 2 years, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I was going to find Elias. I was going to find out the truth. And when I did, I was going to make him pay. But revenge isn't as simple as people think. It's not just anger. It's patience, calculation, a game of shadows and silence where one wrong move can turn you into the villain instead of the victor. Over the next few nights, the calls kept coming. Always 3 a.m., always silent after that single phrase, "You shouldn't have answered." But I started noticing small things, little changes that made me realize these calls weren't random at all. The number changed slightly each time, but the pattern of digits, it was familiar, almost like coordinates. It took me a few days to realize what they meant. The numbers corresponded to an address, one outside the city, one I hadn't been to in years, Leela's old art studio. When I drove out there the next morning, the building looked abandoned. Dusty windows, broken lock, graffiti scrawled across the door. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt it, that strange weight in the air, the same heaviness from the night of the first call.
And on the work table, covered in dust and paint stains, was a phone. Leela's old phone. How it got there? I still don't know. But I turned it on, and it lit up like it had been waiting for me. There was only one message on it. No name, no contact, just a video. It was Leela, sitting in that same studio, her eyes red, her voice trembling. She said, "If you're seeing this, something has happened. He knows. Don't trust him. Don't let him find you."
Then, static. The video cut off halfway through her sentence. But that was all I needed. Because the camera angle, the faint reflection in the mirror behind her, showed Elias standing in the doorway. That was the moment everything inside me hardened into something sharp, something dangerous. Because if he'd done this to her, if he'd covered it up, moved on, lived his life like nothing happened, then I was going to destroy him piece by piece. Not by killing him, no. That would be too easy, too quick. I was going to make him live long enough to lose everything that ever mattered to him. And so it began. I pulled the door shut behind me and sat on the cold concrete step, breathing like I'd sprinted a marathon when really I'd only driven across town. The video on Leela's phone replayed in my head on a loop. Her voice, the mirror behind her, the silhouette in the doorway, Elias. Every small thing I dismissed as coincidence clicked into place like a lock tumbling open. The calls at 3 a.m. weren't random. The phone at the studio wasn't random. Someone, or something, was pushing me toward a truth someone else had buried. And I realized right then that if I wanted answers, I'd have to do what the police wouldn't. Look where they told me not to look, ask questions they told me to stop asking, and be willing to get my hands dirty in ways that scared me. I drove home that morning with a slow, cold fury coiling inside me. It wasn't the heat of the moment anger you see in movies. It was a precise, surgical rage. I remember thinking aloud, because saying it out loud made it real, you don't get to take her and walk away. Say it with me for a second. If someone you loved disappeared, and the man you trusted took the smiling picture at her funeral and kept his life moving, what would you do? Be honest. Would you wait for justice, or would you become it? First thing I did was make a list. Not a dramatic one, nothing fancy, just a dirty, pragmatic column of what I knew and what I needed. What I knew, Elias sold the house, was in real estate, had the charm people fall for, and he'd been in Leela's last moments. What I needed, proof, documents, names, money trails, people who could corroborate that he was different in private than he was in meetings. I needed to find a weakness, a thread I could pull that would unravel more than I could pull alone. I started small. I spent the next week like an investigator with a vendetta. I dug into property records, corporate filings, and public databases. Elias's name was tied to a string of shell companies. Nothing illegal by itself, but the pattern suggested someone who hid things, assets, deals, maybe secrets. I called the real estate offices he'd worked at, pretending to be an investor, asking casual questions, listening for tone and slip-ups. You'd be surprised how much people say to a warm, curious voice. A nervous laugh, a half answer, a name mentioned like it was nothing. I wrote everything down. At night, the calls continued. Always at 3 a.m., always that whisper. The first few nights after I found the video, I thought about disconnecting my phone, burning it maybe. But the calls had become a compass. I began to suspect they were sentences in a language only I could read. Nudges pointing me to places I'd either forgotten or been too afraid to enter. One call, one long string of numbers, had sent me to the studio. Another hinted at a storage unit. Another at a small cafe on the east side of town. The pattern was maddening and exact, like someone wanted me to follow breadcrumb by breadcrumb. At the cafe, a barista named Marisol had a scar on her knuckle and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes in a museum, out of place and fragile.
She remembered Elias because he'd once tried to charm a discount out of her manager and fluffed it up into a joke. She also remembered Leela, how she'd sat at the back table painting on napkins, how she used to leave little sketches behind. She was lovely, Marisol said softly, and then, almost by accident, she added, he wasn't always like that. He changed after the investors came in. He started wearing better suits and talking like he owned the world. I started to map Elias's edges, partners, past lovers, names of companies. One name kept appearing in strange places, Calder and Chase. I dug into Calder and Chase and found a small investment firm with a reputation for bulldozing indie artists into selling property rights and studio spaces. A lot of their deals weren't illegal, they were predatory in ways the law struggled to define. Artists who sold their work saw their livelihoods dry up. I found a blog post from an artist in another city who'd lost a gallery to Calder and Chase. The tone was bitter and raw. The comment thread mentioned Elias, thinly veiled, as a closer who knew how to make owners sign anything. That was my first win. Not proof, but pattern. I felt the kind of satisfaction that's equal parts relief and hunger. Relief at having a direction, hunger for something more, concrete, undeniable. I started following Elias's supposed partners and watching the ways they moved money. I trawled the public records until my eyes stung. It was tedious, slow work, the kind of labor that chips away at a mountain until you find a seam. I learned how to act like a nobody, an unremarkable person who asked questions in the plainest voice. People told me things to fill silence. Sometimes they told me too much. And then came the first obstacle, suspicion. At a community art fair, I wandered into a conversation about the sale of a block of warehouses. One of the men there was Elias's old partner, Greg. Broad shoulders, a soft smile, a handshake that lingered too long. He saw me watching him. He smiled the kind of smile that had teeth like a trap. "You look familiar," he said. I felt every hair on my arms go taut. I told myself a lie, that I was just a fan of the neighborhood. He nodded, the smile smooth, and then left. Later that night, a car slowed outside my house and the radio played static for 10 minutes. The calls at 3 a.m. felt like they were testing me, watching to see if I would flinch. Close calls became a pattern. I learned quickly that someone who cuts the edges of legality can smell curiosity. They deter it by making you fear for small things, your privacy, your daily routines, your friends. A man I had been talking to about Elias's art acquisitions got a call that made him cut me off overnight. A woman who had once been a source suddenly stopped returning texts. Someone tapped my internet line and left it crackling for hours, so I knew I wasn't just paranoid. Every time I thought I had a step forward, there was a consequence. But each consequence taught me something. Who was watchful, who was scared, who could be pushed. So I changed my tactics. If I wanted to beat a man who was practiced at being two-faced, I had to be better at shapes than he was at masks. I started to cultivate allies. People who'd been damaged by Calder and Chase started to surface as I followed threads. A former manager who'd been bullied out of a studio space. A janitor who'd seen men carrying boxes late at night. An ex-assistant who'd been paid off to keep quiet. They all had small truths that together started forming a picture. We met in parks and diner booths, swapping names and receipts, and our conversations were lit by the kind of fierce, shared grief that hammers out loyalty. "If he did this to Leela, he'll do it again," the ex-assistant said once. "Men like that think they're invincible."
I learned to emulate him. Elias moved through rooms with calculated charm. I moved through rooms like a shadow. Where he used loud confidence, I used quiet observation. Where he bought people's time with favors and flattery, I bought information with anonymity and patience. I wrote fake emails, created dummy accounts, and asked seemingly innocent questions that got answers. I couldn't break into bank accounts or commit illegal acts. I'm not a monster. So I used the human infrastructure he relied on. A secretary would let slip a meeting time if you asked about her kid's school. A contractor would reveal the storage unit number if you mentioned a shared nostalgia for old vinyls. The real trick of thoughtful revenge is that you rarely need to invent disasters. You only need to reveal what's already crumbling. And reveal I did. Over the course of a month, I unraveled a knot. Elias was laundering a portion of his commissions through shell companies and then funneling them into a private trust under the name Calder and Chase Holdings. Shell companies in neighboring states, invoices with inflated numbers, and deals that had been swept past lawyers' noses while they took their summer vacations. There were severed contracts and signatures that had been added after the fact. It was messy, technical stuff, not the kind of thing you can pin on a man without a paper trail, but the paper trail existed, stale and brittle, like an old skeleton waiting for a hand to pull it out. That's when I decided to step up the pressure. A calculated reveal would do more than humiliation. It would set forces in motion. The plan had to be layered. First, sow doubt publicly. Second, expose financial misdeeds to people who could not ignore them. Bank officers, small investors, the local press. Third, use the whisper calls, those midnight nudges, to lead me to physical evidence Elias himself had overlooked. I had to be careful. One misstep, and I'd be the one under suspicion, the grieving sister turned conspiracy theorist. You know how the best revenge stories aren't just loud explosions? They're quiet, surgical, like removing the screws from an expensive watch. You don't break it. You take what makes it tick and show that without it, the whole thing is useless. The first screw I removed was perception. Elias was a public performer. He had charity photos and mild scandal-free mentions in lifestyle pieces. He needed a crack in that public persona so people would start looking. I couldn't fake a scandal. Instead, I started passing small, believable whispers to people who listen for gossip. A rumor here, an anonymous tip to a local blogger about an investor who bullied artists into contracts there, a quiet email to a reporter who loved corruption stories. Planting rumors felt petty until they multiplied into pattern. Journalists began to ask questions to Elias's business contacts. Calls were made to his office. At first, the answers were smooth, lawyerly statements, firm denials, but the idea had been planted. Next, I aimed for money. I gathered documents, scanned copies of contracts, receipts stolen from a dumpster behind one of his recently vacated properties. Sometimes the trash keeps the best secrets. The ledger entries someone from a partner firm leaked anonymously after I'd cultivated their low-level resentment. I took these to a small, independent investigative reporter who'd written about Calder and Chase before. She was sharp, caffeine-powered, and had a knack for following threads others missed. I gave her the files and told her, "You don't need to run with everything, just the parts that don't add up." She looked at me for a long time like she was measuring me, then nodded and said, "If this is true, it's not just about money, it's about people." Meanwhile, the 3 a.m. calls kept shaping my nights. Sometimes they were a single ring. Sometimes they were a series of numbers that, when I traced them, led to places Elias frequented: an old storage facility, a little used office in the industrial park, a woman's apartment where painters met. And sometimes, the most chilling nights, the whisper came with a detail only Lila would have known: the way she called me by a childhood nickname, the phrase she used only when drunk on summer rooftops. Whoever was pushing these clues wasn't just trying to spook me. They were guiding me like a hand on my back towards a confrontation. They said you shouldn't have answered, repeatedly, like a warning or maybe an instruction. I couldn't tell which. This phase of probing didn't come without risks. Once, as I was taking photographs of a storage unit labeled with a number from a call, a security guard shuffled across the lot. I ducked behind a dumpster and heard him whistle. Casual, unnatural. He spoke into his radio. "That one's back." I froze, heart slamming. For a second, I thought it was over. But then he strolled away, bored, and I realized he'd assumed I was a tenant. Small escapes like that taught me to be invisible when I needed to be. Hood up, voice low, movement deliberate.
I learned to make my presence seem ordinary. Ordinary is safe. A breakthrough came when the investigative reporter called me, voice tight with excitement. She'd found a contractor who'd been paid in cash for renovations on a property Elias once owned. The contractor remembered a locked box that a man had asked him to move into storage, a box that smelled faintly of turpentine and paint. The contractor had kept a scrap of packing tape with a return address on it before he'd been paid off. The address, it turned out, belonged to a storage unit in a facility in the county. We went there the next day. Opening that unit felt like opening a wound. Inside were canvases stacked like secrets, sketches with corners chewed by time, and shoved under a tarpaulin, a small metal box. When I opened it, my hand shook so hard, the key clattered. Inside were notes, financial receipts, a ledger that connected Elias to payments that matched the dates surrounding Lila's disappearance, and a ledger entry marked with Lila's name, and a sum that made my stomach drop. The papers were not the smoking gun that would arrest a man, but they were proof of intent, payments, hush money, and the kind of financial maneuvering that corrals truth. That night, I sat on the living room floor with Lila's phone on my lap, and the papers fanned out like playing cards. The whisper on the other end of the midnight calls felt close, like a presence. "What would you have done in my shoes?" I asked the dark room out loud, the way you ask a friend when you need someone to be on your side. I had no answer, except the one I'd already chosen: push forward. I remember a strange mix of feelings then, not just anger, but a hollow loneliness, as though walking this path meant surrendering any chance of soft mornings or light conversation. There were moral questions I had to live with. How far would I go? At what point did I become the thing I hated? Those questions didn't go away. They followed me like shadows, sharpening my strategy. I made rules for myself. No physical harm, no illegal break-ins. I would reveal truth, not manufacture it. I would force consequences through the system's own mechanisms: exposure, loss of reputation, financial audit. Let the law do what it could do. I would only give it the truth it needed.
Plan in hand, allies at my side, a reporter ready to run, and a trove of documents that painted a damning pattern. I prepared to push Elias where it hurt most, his empire of respectability. The next steps were about timing. If I moved too fast, he'd vanish. If I moved too slow, he'd burn my sources. I watched him. I learned his schedules. I even drove by his current apartment late at night, noting the cars, the faces that came and went, the security guard who smiled too easily. Each small observation let me place a chess piece. The game was on. There were nights the whisper would come and I would break into tears over coffee, clutching Lila's phone like it was the only anchor I had left. I wondered if she could see me from wherever she was, if the thing nudging me through the calls was actually her or something she left behind. Sometimes revenge feels like a betrayal of the person you loved. You trade their memory for action. But in the quiet, I realized this was different. This was honoring her by refusing to let her story end in a note that said accident. It was messy, yes, and dangerous, sure. But it felt like truth, and truth has a way of making even the most comfortable men uncomfortable. So I kept unpeeling him. Small public whispers became calls to his partners. Calls became a story draft in the reporter's hands. The reporter began to photograph contracts, interview disgruntled artists, and prepare to publish. Meanwhile, I used the calls to find the physical evidence: ledgers, a box of letters, a file folder with his signature scrawled askew. And with each item I found, the 3 a.m. whispering in my ear shifted, as if whoever was guiding me was pleased, or maybe they were impatient. Either way, I knew the moment of reckoning was coming. The plan was working, the chessboard was set, and the pieces were beginning to move in ways that would force Elias to choose: run, deny, or break. But I knew him better than anyone. He wouldn't go quietly. He'd try to turn this back on me, to paint me as the unstable sister who couldn't let go. He'd use charm and lawyers and smear campaigns. That meant the next phase had to be unassailable. Documents would have to be verifiable, sources protected, and evidence handed to the right people at the right time. It would have to be ugly enough to make him lose his footing, but clean enough to survive scrutiny. As I tucked the stack of papers into Lila's phone case and switched off the lights in the studio that night, I felt something like peace. Not peace as people usually know it, but the kind that comes from finally choosing a path. The calls would keep ringing at 3 a.m. for reasons I still couldn't explain. But now, every whisper felt like encouragement. It said, "You shouldn't have answered." Maybe it was a warning, or maybe it was the first sentence in a story that would end with me making him answer for what he did. Would you have done the same? Would you have walked into that dark hallway, phone in hand, and chosen to make someone pay? Be honest. I'm not asking to absolve myself. I'm asking because I want you to understand that for me, it stopped being about vengeance in the petty sense and became a long, cold reclamation of the life someone took. The next part of this plan would be about exposing him publicly and watching his world crack, but that's where I'll pick up next. I handed the reporter the files with a calm I didn't feel. I remember the way she looked at the papers like someone staring at the key to a locked room. She asked questions, precise, surgical. She said, "Do you want your name on this?" My answer came quicker than I expected. Not yet. I wasn't ready to be the public face of my own grief. I wanted the facts to speak first, then let the world decide who I was. We agreed on a plan. She would run an initial piece that framed Calder and Chase's dealings with artists as predatory, using the evidence we had as the backbone. No accusations of murder, no claims that would make the paper liable, just facts, trail of money, testimonies from people whose lives had been affected. The goal was to crack his reputation open, slowly, legally, undeniably. I thought Elias would react with smooth denials. Instead, the first wave of fallout came from places I hadn't expected. Former clients, artists who had been quietly pushed out of their careers, a gallery owner who admitted in a tearful voice that he'd been intimidated into signing away an artist's rights. The reporter's article landed like a pebble in a pond. The ripples reached farther than we thought. Calder and Chase's phone lines lit up with angry calls. Investors asked for meetings. Social media amplified every disgruntled comment into a chorus. Elias's carefully curated image, charity events, skull photos, toothy smiles, began to look brittle. He called me the day the article dropped. He used my name in that polished, hollow way he reserved for people he wanted to manipulate. He said, "I've been getting some nasty messages." Voice deceptively calm. "Are you involved in this?" I kept the phone away from my ear and let the reporter's article read for me. My throat tightened, but I kept my voice steady. I said, "I had nothing to do with the piece, but I have information that contradicts what you've told people." He laughed then, the kind of laugh that's a warning, and said, "You don't know what you're doing. Walk away." I almost told him to look at himself in the mirror, to remember the last night he saw Lila alive, but I didn't. I let him think he'd scared me. He didn't. His retaliation was textbook. Charm the frightened, silence the angry, intimidate the vocal. He called in favors, and people who'd been ready to talk retreated like poles pulled from the ground. The reporter got threats on her phone. The contractor who'd given us the scrap of packing tape got a visit from men in suits who offered him money and asked him to forget he'd ever seen us. Fear crept into our camp. Allies started to flinch. I had to keep them close, reassure them, and sometimes bribe their courage with cash I didn't have but pretended to. Revenge is expensive, not just in money, but in trust and the constant balancing of who you can rely on. There was a night, one of the worst, when I woke to find my apartment door unlocked. My heart leapt into my throat.
I called the friend who'd been staying with me for a few nights, and he said he'd seen nothing, but a photo was missing from Lila's old frame on the mantel, a picture of us laughing at the beach when we were girls. I sat on the floor and screamed until my throat hurt. Whoever wanted me to stop was trying to up the ante, to make me feel the vulnerability that came with being exposed. But the missing photo did something surprising. It hardened my resolve. Tearing one small piece of my life didn't scare me into silence. It reminded me what I was fighting for. The next phase had to be methodical. I could expose financial misconduct, but to force legal teeth into the case, I needed more. Testimonial evidence, a pattern that prosecutors could use, a trail that wouldn't be shrugged away. So I turned to the small people in Elias's orbit, the assistants who kept the receipts, the contractors who moved things in the night, the artists who had been bullied into signing contracts. Getting them to talk required time and the kind of empathy you can't fake. I'd sit with them in diners, hands wrapped around hot coffee, and let them tell me their stories until they trusted me enough to give me names. The more I listened, the clearer the web became. Money moving through shadow companies, small cash payments labeled as consulting, a trail of favors and hushes. Every name I collected became another notch on a list that would one day be read in a courtroom, or printed in ink that would corrode his public standing.
Then came a night that made my stomach drop. One of those moments where you realize you're closer than you thought, and your enemy knows it. I was at a late meeting with the reporter, whispering over a parking lot bench, when two cars rolled slowly past. Their headlights dipped, and I saw a familiar profile through the glass. Greg, Elias's old partner. He raised a hand like he was offering peace. I felt every hair on my arm rise. He didn't get out of the car. He just drove away, slow as if he wanted to be seen. It was a warning and a taunt. You're playing a dangerous game. Go home. I didn't. Instead, I used the moment. That same night, I called a lawyer I'd been quietly cultivating, someone who'd represented whistleblowers before. I laid out the ledger, the maker's marks on invoices, the contractor's testimony. He listened, then said, "You have something here. I can't make promises, but it's worth pursuing." I slept for 2 hours that night, the kind where consciousness is a thin sheet draped over an abyss. I dreamt of Leela, standing at the mouth of a dark hallway, phone pressed to her ear, whispering a single line that felt like both a blessing and a curse. You shouldn't have answered. The legal route required paperwork. It required me to walk into rooms with men who smelled of expensive cologne and had practiced dismissive smiles. It required me to sign affidavits and give testimony under oath. Each step was a small surrender. I had to reveal details of my life I barely remembered and stand up in front of people and tell the truth like it was sharpened into evidence. It was draining. It was necessary. As the investigations picked up, Elias's behavior escalated from passive-aggressive to overtly hostile. He filed a defamation suit against the reporter, a move meant to silence and intimidate. The paper fought back. Legal teams smelled blood. Lawyers smelled the sweet money of a big case. The court filings were dense and technical, but the gist of it was public. Calder and Chase alleged the reporter's article had damaged their reputation. That was the opening I needed. Public court filings meant public scrutiny. Depositions meant sworn testimony. We had been collecting signatures, receipts, and witness statements for months. Enough, I hoped, to survive cross-examination. You have to understand what that period felt like. Every time I stepped into a courtroom, I felt like I was stepping into a coliseum. Cameras flashed, murmurs followed me like tailwind. Elias sat there like a man who had bought himself a place at the table of the city's best dinners. He watched me with a look that tried to convince the room he was the victim. He wasn't, but he was skilled at playing innocence to a crowd that preferred comfortable narratives. So we made it hard for him. The reporter's team provided corroborated documents. The contractor, who'd been paid cash, stood up and told the world what he'd seen. The pieces stacked, steady and slow. Then, because life loves irony, Elias made a mistake.
Complacency, after years of practiced deception, becomes a dangerous vice. He began to slip in ways only someone who'd been watching him like a hawk could notice. A meeting scheduled twice, a signature signed by the wrong hand, a check that bounced because his shell company hadn't been funded correctly. I remember the day I noticed it. I was staring at a scanned invoice when I saw the same handwriting on two documents that should have different signatories. It was like seeing a fingerprint on glass. Once you spot one, you see them everywhere. We used that. The lawyer filed subpoenas. Bank records were requested. Calder and Chase's legal team tried to claim everything was above board, that minor errors were just clerical. But clerical errors, when paired with testimonies and matching paper trails, become problems you can't wish away. Depositions were scheduled, and the man who had once smiled through press events started to look tired in public. He grew defensive. He'd been willing to sign his name 1,000 times in confident script. He wasn't prepared for the slow, grinding work of being cross-examined. The tipping point came not from one thing, but from a cascade. A contractor's testimony, an accountant's ledger, a celebrity artist who'd decided to speak publicly about being pressured into an unfavorable sale by Calder and Chase. That artist interview was a turning point. People began to see Elias not as a charming fixer, but as someone who profited from other people's loss. Sponsors pulled back. Investors asked for audits. The press dug deeper. The calls at 3 a.m. continued, always leaning into my ear like a metronome. The whisper, both cruel and kind. You shouldn't have answered. Elias began to crumble in smaller, human ways. He yelled at staff in private, his voice sharp like the crack of a whip. He missed charity events. He avoided cameras. The man who had once moved through rooms with practiced grace now looked like someone trying to remember his next line from a play he'd never been rehearsed for. People who had once circled him like moths backed away. The non-legal consequences, the social ostracism, the financial scrutiny, did what the law sometimes could not. They stripped his power in public view. But even as his world shifted, he lashed out. He attempted to discredit me personally, feeding anonymous tips to a woman who ran an online gossip column, trying to paint me as a disgruntled sister with an agenda. I expected that. I'd prepared. My allies corroborated my timeline. The reporter kept her nose to the grindstone. When the gossip piece ran, it was weak, full of insinuation and little meat. People read it and shrugged. The factual reporting overshadowed the whispers. For the first time in months, I felt a small, fragile satisfaction bloom in my chest. There were moments of danger. Once, as I drove late one night, a car followed me for 3 blocks. I ducked into a grocery store and waited, walking up and down aisles like a ghost. The car kept moving. I called my lawyer and told him everything. He said, "We'll document this. Filed complaint. Be careful." It's funny how the smallest things start to matter when you're in the middle of a war. Checking locks twice, making sure friends knew my schedule, not going anywhere alone at night. I had become cautious in ways that made my old self seem frivolous. But caution kept me alive, and alive was necessary, alive to see the end. The climax of our slow-burning campaign arrived on a gray Tuesday morning when the city announced a formal probe into Calder and Chase. An independent auditor was named, and federal investigators asked to see documents. The paper that had first run the piece published a follow-up with a damning headline, "Major Irregularities Found in Artist Contracts." Elias went on television that evening, pale and defensive, trying to salvage what was left of his reputation. He spoke of mistakes and mismanagement and promised cooperation. His words felt thin, the way tissue paper feels when you try to hold water. The downfall wasn't immediate. Men like him rarely fall overnight, but the cascade accelerated. Partners resigned, investors withdrew. Lawsuits began to mount. Not just the defamation suit he had filed, but class actions from artists who'd been wronged. Professional associations issued statements distancing themselves. The man who had once eaten dinner at the city's best tables now found himself alone in rooms where people looked away. Throughout it all, the midnight calls continued, punctuating my nights with the refrain that had become both curse and compass. I never found out who or what had been making them. Sometimes I think it was Leela in a way I can't explain, or the fragments of memory she left in her studio, or maybe a kind anonymous friend who wanted to make sure I kept moving. I never asked. It felt like a private ghost that was content to guide me until the work was done. Whatever it was, it had kept me awake, it had prodded me, and it had never let me forget that someone else had been taken from me.
When the final hearings came, Elias sat in the front row, his face drawn, his hands folded like someone waiting for a verdict that would decide his life. I sat in the gallery, Leela's photo tucked into my jacket, and watched as the truth unfolded in sworn testimony and document after document. The lawyers argued, and the judge listened. The slow, patient thing we'd built, evidence, witness statements, media scrutiny, bore down on him like gravity. In the end, there was no dramatic confession. There was no cinematic takedown where villains collapse in a heap. Instead, there were panels of facts and the steady accumulation of proof that left no comfortable space for excuses. The result wasn't perfect justice. The legal system is a blunt tool in a world of fine edges. Elias paid fines, was barred from certain positions, and faced civil penalties that gutted his empire. He lost clients, partnerships, and crucially, his standing. Some would say it was enough. Others still whispered that he'd gotten off light. I had to live with the truth that revenge rarely matches the scale of loss. It reshapes the landscape, but it doesn't rebuild the house that burnt. Leela didn't come back, but the man who had stood where her life had been stolen could no longer walk the same streets unchallenged. When the dust settled, I stood in Leela's studio one last time. The canvases were cleaned and cataloged. Those that could be saved were promised to artists and to a small foundation that would honor their creators. The ledger I'd pulled from the storage unit sat in a box of evidence in the prosecutor's office. The calls at 3 a.m. stopped. For a while after the case closed, my phone would sometimes flicker with remembered patterns, little ghosts of digits, but the steady ring that had haunted me for weeks no longer came. There's a strange aftertaste to the end of a long fight. You expect triumph to feel like fireworks, but mostly it felt like quiet, an exhale, a small letting go, the kind you do when you realize you can finally stop checking the locks at night. I walked through the city and noticed small things again, the way sunlight hit the cafe window, the laugh of a stranger on the subway, and I let them in like a cautious friend. People asked me, often with a tone that mixed curiosity and judgment, if I felt better. The question is complicated. There's relief, yes, an enormous, heavy relief, like a boulder rolled off my chest. But there's also grief that doesn't leave. You can orchestrate consequences. You can expose a liar. You can strip someone of the things they value, but you can't bring laughter back into a voice or rethread the hours that were stolen. Some nights, I still wake up at 3 a.m., hand reaching for a phone that isn't there. And for a moment, the old panic returns. Then I breathe, and I remember that the call stopped because I answered them with patience and purpose. If you followed me this far, you know I didn't become a monster. I became someone who could sit in a courtroom and say, with evidence at her side, that the person she loved had been wronged. I became someone who refused to let a narrative be closed with a brush of accident. I became a sister who, in the messy and imperfect language available to human beings, did what she could to make sure truth had teeth. Would you have done the same? Would you have walked into those dark rooms, called witnesses, sat through depositions, and watched a man you once trusted lose his life as he knew it? Be honest. Maybe you'd have burned the place down, or maybe you'd have let the law take its slow, imperfect course. There's no single right answer here, only the messy one that feels like justice to the wounded heart. For me,
The path was worth it, not because it brought my sister back, but because it forced a man responsible for so much quiet harm to stand in the light he had tried to avoid. I kept one thing from the studio, a small sketch Leela had left behind, a loose drawing of a woman walking down a hallway, looking back over her shoulder. I framed it and put it on my mantle. Sometimes I stand and look at it and whisper, "You were heard." Then I turn the lamp on and go make coffee, because life, mercifully, keeps moving forward.